All right, welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to demystify the mechanical relationships of the macroeconomy. We hear terms like recession, trade deficit, and capital inflows thrown around in the news literally every day. But how do they actually connect? Well, today we are building a mental dashboard. We'll start by looking at how the economy naturally pulses and fluctuates, and then we're going to zoom out to see how that domestic activity links up with the rest of the globe through trade and finance. Let's dive right in.
Here is our quick roadmap for this session. First, the anatomy of business cycles. Second, open economy national income. Third, the balance of payments. And finally, the capital and current accounts.
Okay, Section 1, Anatomy of Business Cycles, Understanding the Boom and Bust. Let's trace how output fluctuates irregularly from peak to trough. You know, in theory, there's this straight, upward-sloping trend line that represents how the economy should seamlessly grow over time as technology and the labor force expand. But the wavy line? That tells the real story. Output doesn't grow at a perfectly smooth trend rate. Instead, it fluctuates. It climbs through a recovery up to a peak, and then it drops down through a recession to a trough. These deviations from the trend are what we call the output gap, and the human cost of these dips can be absolutely severe. For instance, think back to the steep 1982 recession. Unemployment hit a staggering 10.8%. That meant over 12 million Americans were out of work, making it the highest levels since the Great Depression at that time.
It's really essential to note that despite the term cycle, these fluctuations are highly irregular in both timing and size. The word cycle kind of makes it sound like a perfectly timed pendulum, right? But it's actually incredibly unpredictable. Recessions are as irregular as they are common. Sometimes you get two back-to-back, and other times a whole decade passes without a single one. Because of this unpredictability, these turning points, the exact peaks and troughs, are closely tracked and officially dated by specialized groups like the National Bureau of Economic Research. They act as the official arbiter of when a recession truly begins and ends.
Moving on to Section 2, Open Economy National Income, Measuring the Global Engine. Now that we recognize the economy fluctuates, we need a rigorous accounting framework to measure these shifts. And since we don't live in a vacuum, we have to measure these shifts when a nation trades with the outside world. Let's build our core macroeconomic identity step by step, moving from a closed system to an open one. In a closed economy, total expenditure is simple. It's just consumption plus investment plus government purchases. That's step one. But in an open economy, some of what we produce is sold abroad. So step 2, we must add foreign spending on our domestic goods, which we call exports. But wait, some of our domestic spending went toward things produced in other countries. Since those aren't part of our country's output, step 3 requires us to subtract domestic spending on foreign goods, and those are our imports.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that in an open economy, total output, denoted by Y, equals domestic spending, consumption, investment, and government purchases, plus net exports, which is simply exports minus imports. This fundamentally links a country's production to global demand. And here's why this matters. It proves that a country's spending in any given year doesn't actually have to equal its output. If output exceeds domestic spending, we export the difference. If our domestic spending exceeds our output, we have to import the difference.
This brilliantly illustrates the real-world magnitude of those net exports. For highly integrated, export-driven engines like Germany and China, massive exports and imports make up a huge percentage of their total GDP. Now compare that to the United States. While the absolute dollar amounts are massive, as a percentage of total output, U.S. trade is remarkably smaller. So while international trade is a fundamental part of the macroeconomic dashboard, its weight varies drastically depending on which country's economy you're actually analyzing.
All right, Section 3, The Balance of Payments, Tracking International Flows. How does a nation actually keep track of all this back and forth? Well, think of the balance of payments as the ultimate macroeconomic ledger. It captures every single economic interaction between a country's residents and the rest of the world. And by residents, we mean individuals, households, businesses, and even the government. Whether you're buying a foreign car, sending a gift to a relative overseas, an airline selling planes to Europe, or a portfolio manager purchasing a foreign government bond, every single one of these actions is carefully tallied up in this master ledger.
To make sense of this massive ledger, we divide it into two main pillars. The current account deals with the actual flow of goods and services, as well as transfer payments like remittances. It's really just the trade balance, exports minus imports, plus net investment income. On the other hand, the capital account deals strictly with finance and asset ownership. It records the purchases and sales of things like stocks, bonds, bank deposits, and real estate. Let's put it this way. If you buy a physical computer from Japan, that hits the current account. But if you buy stock in a Japanese computer company, that hits the capital account.
Finally, Section 4, the capital and current accounts, the rule of balance.
Let's see how this all builds into an inescapable mathematical reality for any open economy. Looking at historical data for the U.S. balance of payments from 1989 to 1991, we see something pretty wild. In 1989, the U.S. had a current account deficit of $106 billion, meaning it was spending far more abroad than it earned from exports. But look at the capital account right below it. In that exact same year, there was a net private capital inflow of $121 billion. The massive current account deficits were offset by massive net private capital inflows. It's a striking look at how trade imbalances and financial flows basically mirror each other.
And you know, this isn't just a coincidence in the data. It's a rigid accounting identity. Current account deficit plus net capital inflow equals 0. The central point of international payments is incredibly simple. Individuals and firms have to pay for what they buy abroad. If a country spends more than its income running a current account deficit, it absolutely must finance that deficit by either selling off its assets to foreigners or by borrowing from them. There's no magic money tree here. Any deficit in the current account is, by necessity, financed by an offsetting surplus in the capital account.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider a pretty alarming vulnerability. We've seen that the business cycle guarantees eventual downturns, right? And we've also seen that a country running a trade deficit completely relies on foreign capital inflows to balance its books. So ask yourself, how can a nation maintain its standard of living and balance its master ledger when international financing suddenly dries up during an economic recession? It's a delicate balancing act for sure, and one that central bankers lose sleep over every single night. Because if foreign wallets snap shut, the domestic economy pays the price. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and we'll see you next time.